Jake Martinez had exactly 17 credits left in his account when his stomach started growling. He stared at the flickering hologram displaying his pathetic balance on his wrist communicator and sighed. Being a freelance cargo hauler in the outer rim systems wasn't exactly the glamorous space adventure he'd imagined as a kid back on Earth. His small ship, the Rusty Bucket, was currently docked at Nexus Station, a massive trading hub that floated in the neutral zone between 3 different galactic territories. The station was a melting pot of alien species, all trying to make a living in the vast emptiness of space. Jake had just finished delivering a shipment of recycled atmospheric processors to a mining colony, and the payment barely covered his fuel costs. The growling in his stomach grew louder. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, surviving on nothing but nutrition bars that tasted like cardboard mixed with sadness. There was a food court on level 7 of the station, but even the cheapest meals there cost at least 20 credits. Jake did some quick math in his head and realized he couldn't afford anything decent. That's when he remembered the vending machines on level 12. They were old, barely maintained, and mostly used by maintenance workers and other broke spacers like himself. Jake had heard rumors that sometimes you could find decent food there for just a few credits. It was worth a shot. He made his way through the crowded corridors of the station, dodging floating cargo pods and avoiding the tentacles of a particularly grumpy Zephyrian trader. The artificial gravity felt a bit weak on this level, making each step feel slightly bouncy. Jake had gotten used to the sensation after years of space travel, but it still made him miss the solid ground of Earth sometimes. Level 12 was much quieter than the main commercial areas. The lighting was dimmer, and the air had that recycled taste that came from overworked life support systems. Jake found the vending machine area tucked away in a corner near the maintenance shafts. There were 3 machines lined up against the wall, humming quietly to themselves. The first machine was completely broken, its screen dark and a handwritten sign that said, "Out of order," in about 15 different alien languages. The second machine looked promising until Jake saw that it only accepted payment in Regelian currency, which he definitely didn't have. The third machine, however, seemed to be working. It was older than the others, with scratched metal panels and a display screen that flickered occasionally. Jake approached it cautiously and examined the selection of food items displayed behind the transparent barrier. Most of it looked like standard space rations, but there was one item that caught his eye. In the bottom corner, behind a small glass door, sat what appeared to be a wrapped sandwich. The label was written in several alien scripts, but there was a small Earth Standard translation that read, "Traditional delicacy -5 credits." Jake's mouth watered at the thought of something that might actually have flavor. He inserted his credit chip into the machine and pressed the selection button. The machine made a series of mechanical noises, whirred for a moment, then dispensed the wrapped item with a satisfying thunk. Jake picked it up and examined it closely. The wrapper was made of some kind of metallic material that felt warm to the touch, and there were symbols printed on it that he didn't recognize. Finding a nearby bench, Jake unwrapped his purchase carefully. Inside was what looked like a perfectly ordinary sandwich, 2 slices of bread with some kind of meat and vegetables inside. It smelled amazing, like nothing he'd experienced before. The aroma seemed to combine the best aspects of every delicious meal he'd ever eaten. Jake took his first bite and immediately knew something was different. The flavors were incredible, but more than that, he felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through his body. It wasn't unpleasant, just unusual, like a mild electrical current running through his nervous system. He figured it was probably just the effects of finally eating real food after days of nutrition bars. As he continued eating, the tingling sensation grew stronger. Jake started to feel more alert, more aware of his surroundings. His hearing seemed sharper. He could make out conversations from across the corridor that he shouldn't have been able to hear. His vision became clearer, and he noticed details in the metal paneling of the walls that he'd never seen before. By the time he finished the sandwich, Jake felt better than he had in years. The constant ache in his back from sleeping in the cramped quarters of his ship was gone. His mind felt clearer and more focused. Even his old injury from a cargo handling accident seemed to have stopped bothering him. Jake was examining the wrapper, trying to figure out what kind of food could have such an immediate effect, when his wrist communicator started beeping frantically. The display showed an incoming message marked with the highest priority designation he'd ever seen, Level 10 Urgent, which was reserved for galactic emergencies. The message was brief but confusing. Human designation Jake Martinez. Report to Central Command immediately. Imperial escort en route? Do not attempt to leave the station. Jake stared at the message in bewilderment. Imperial escort? He'd never had any dealings with the Galactic Empire. He was just a small-time cargo hauler trying to make enough money to keep his ship running. Why would the Empire be interested in him? Before he could process this information fully, the corridor filled with the sound of marching boots. Jake looked up to see a squad of Imperial guards approaching, their polished armor gleaming under the station's lights. These weren't the regular security forces that kept order on Nexus Station. These were elite troops from the Imperial core worlds. The lead guard stopped in front of Jake and removed his helmet, revealing a stern face with cybernetic implants around his eyes. Human Jake Martinez? He asked in accented standard galactic. Jake nodded, still too confused to speak. By order of Her Imperial Majesty, you are to be escorted to the Imperial flagship immediately. Please come with us. Jake wanted to ask questions, to demand an explanation, but something in the guard's tone suggested that cooperation would be his best option. He stood up slowly, still holding the empty wrapper from his sandwich, and followed the guards toward the nearest transport bay. As they walked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that eating that simple sandwich had somehow changed everything. He had no idea how right he was. The Imperial flagship Eternal Dominion was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. As their transport shuttle approached the massive vessel, he pressed his face against the viewport in amazement. The ship was easily 3 kilometers long, its hull a gleaming white that seemed to absorb and reflect light in impossible ways. Elegant spires and towers jutted from its surface, and the entire structure hummed with barely contained energy. The guards remained silent during the journey, but Jake noticed they kept glancing at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it. Respect, maybe? That didn't make sense. He was just a cargo hauler who'd grabbed a sandwich from a vending machine. The shuttle docked with the flagship through an ornate airlock that was larger than Jake's entire ship. As they disembarked, Jake found himself in a corridor that looked more like the inside of a palace than a military vessel. The walls were lined with what appeared to be real marble, and holographic artwork floated in alcoves along the sides. The artificial gravity here was perfectly calibrated, making each step feel natural and comfortable. More guards joined their escort as they made their way deeper into the ship. Jake counted at least 20 soldiers surrounding him now, all wearing the same polished armor and carrying energy weapons that probably cost more than his ship was worth. For someone who was supposedly being escorted rather than arrested, he certainly had a lot of guards. They passed through several security checkpoints, each one more elaborate than the last. At the final checkpoint, Jake had to submit to a full bioscan that examined everything from his DNA to his recent medical history. The technician operating the scanner, a tall alien with blue skin and 4 arms, stared at the results for a long time before nodding to the guards. Confirmed, the technician said in a whisper. The readings are off the charts. How is this possible? Jake wanted to ask what readings they were talking about, but before he could speak, the massive doors in front of them began to open. The sound they made was like the rumble of distant thunder, and Jake felt a strange vibration in his bones as the heavy panels slid apart. Beyond the doors lay the most magnificent room Jake had ever seen. The ceiling stretched at least 50 meters above them, supported by pillars that seemed to be carved from single pieces of crystal. Holographic displays floated throughout the space, showing star maps, fleet positions, and streams of data that Jake couldn't begin to understand. The floor was covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move as he walked across them. At the far end of the room, elevated on a platform that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight, sat the Imperial throne. And on that throne was the most beautiful woman Jake had ever seen. Empress Zarathil was tall and elegant, with skin that had a subtle silver sheen and hair that appeared to be woven from strands of pure energy. Her eyes were the color of deep space, dark blue with flecks of light that sparkled like distant stars. She wore robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of nebulae themselves, shifting between purple and gold as she moved, but what struck Jake most was the expression on her face. She wasn't looking at him with the imperial detachment he would have expected from the ruler of half the galaxy. Instead, she seemed nervous, almost excited. Her hands gripped the arms of her throne tightly, and her eyes never left his face as he approached. The guards stopped about 10 meters from the throne and gestured for Jake to continue alone. He walked forward slowly, acutely aware that every step was being watched by dozens of courtiers, advisors and officials who lined the sides of the chamber. The silence was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. When he reached the base of the platform, Jake wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Should he bow? Kneel? He'd never met royalty before, let alone the ruler of a galactic empire. He settled for a respectful nod and waited for someone to tell him why he was there. Empress Zarathil stood up from her throne and walked down the steps of the platform until she was standing directly in front of him. Up close, Jake could see that she was trembling slightly, and there was something in her expression that looked almost like relief. "You ate the Kethmoran," she said softly. Her voice had a musical quality that seemed to resonate in Jake's chest. After 300 years, someone finally ate the Kethmoran. Jake blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but I don't know what that means. I just bought a sandwich from a vending machine." A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers. The Empress raised her hand for silence, never taking her eyes off Jake's face. "The Kethmoran is not just food," she explained. "It is a sacred bond, a connection that can only be activated by one who is worthy. For 3 centuries we have placed them throughout the galaxy, hoping that someone would be able to consume one and survive the transformation." Jake thought about the strange sensations he'd felt while eating the sandwich. The tingling and the increased awareness. Transformation? The Empress nodded. The Kethmoran contains a symbiotic organism that bonds with the consumer's nervous system. Most beings cannot survive the process. Their bodies reject the organism and they die within minutes. But you... She paused, studying his face intently. "You not only survived, but the bond appears to have strengthened you." Jake was starting to understand why the bioscanner technician had seemed so shocked. "So this organism is inside me now?" "It is part of you now," the Empress corrected. "And according to our oldest laws, that makes you something very special indeed." She turned to address the assembled court, her voice carrying clearly throughout the vast chamber. "Citizens of the Empire, I present to you the one we have waited for. The one who has proven himself worthy by surviving the Kethmoran bond. According to the ancient laws established by my ancestors, he who can consume the sacred food and live is destined to be." She paused dramatically. "My husband." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake felt like his brain had just short-circuited. Husband? He'd gone from being broke and hungry to being engaged to the ruler of a galactic empire, all because he'd eaten a sandwich? "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice cracking slightly. "Did you just say husband?" The Empress turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd entered the chamber, she smiled. It was a radiant expression that seemed to light up the entire room. "The laws are very clear on this matter. The Kethmoran bond can only be formed by one who is destined to rule alongside the imperial line. You are my betrothed, Jake Martinez of Earth." Jake looked around the chamber at the faces of the courtiers and officials. Some seemed pleased by this announcement, others looked shocked, and a few appeared openly hostile. One elderly alien with tentacles for hair was muttering something that sounded distinctly uncomplimentary. "But I don't know anything about ruling an empire," Jake protested. "I can barely keep my own ship running." The Empress stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell something like starlight and winter air. "The bond will teach you what you need to know. The organism that now lives within you carries the wisdom of 1,000 generations. You will learn. Jake felt a strange sensation in his mind, like doors opening in rooms he didn't know existed. Information began flowing into his consciousness, knowledge about galactic politics, military strategy, economic systems, and diplomatic protocols. It was overwhelming, but also somehow natural, as if he were remembering things he'd always known. "This is insane," he whispered. The Empress reached out and took his hand. Her skin felt warm and electric against his. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but it is also our destiny." As Jake looked into her star-filled eyes, he realized that his simple quest for a snack had just changed the fate of the entire galaxy. The next morning found Jake standing on a balcony overlooking the capital city of Zentara Prime, the crown jewel of the Galactic Empire. The city stretched endlessly in all directions, its gleaming spires reaching toward the sky like metallic trees. Flying vehicles moved between the buildings in organized streams, and in the distance Jake could see the massive, orbital elevators that connected the planets. Surfaced to the ring of space stations above, he'd been given quarters in the Imperial Palace that were larger than most. Apartments he'd lived in on Earth. The room came with its own AI assistant, a full entertainment center, and a view that was literally out of this world. Yet despite all this luxury, Jake felt completely lost. The knowledge that the symbiotic organism had given him was incredible but overwhelming. He now understood the complex political structure of the Empire, knew the names and histories of hundreds of alien species, and could speak 17 different galactic languages fluently. But knowing facts about ruling and actually being ready to rule were two very different things. A soft chime indicated someone was requesting entry to his quarters. Jake turned from the balcony as the door slid open to reveal Chancellor Vexstar, the Empire's chief advisor. The Chancellor was a Rigelian, tall and thin, with gray skin and large black eyes. He wore elaborate robes and carried himself with the dignity of someone who had spent centuries in positions of power. "Good morning, Your Highness," the Chancellor said with a bow that Jake was still getting used to. "I trust you slept well?" Jake nodded, though sleep had actually been difficult. His enhanced senses meant he could hear conversations happening several floors away, and his mind kept racing with all the new information it contained. "As well as can be expected, I suppose?" Chancellor Vexstar studied him carefully. Jake got the impression that the alien was trying to figure out whether he was a threat or an opportunity. "The Empress has asked me to begin your orientation to Imperial affairs. There are many things you must learn before the formal betrothal ceremony next week." Next week? Jake still couldn't quite believe how quickly everything was moving. Less than 24 hours ago, he'd been a broke cargo hauler. Now he was apparently getting married to the most powerful woman in the galaxy. "Chancellor," Jake said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Highness. Do you think this is a good idea?" "Me marrying the Empress, I mean. I'm just a human from the Outer Rim. Shouldn't she be marrying someone more suitable?" The Chancellor's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed a slight pause before he answered. "The ancient laws are very clear on this matter. The Kethmoran bond has never been formed by someone who was not destined for greatness. If you survive the process, then you are indeed suitable." It was a diplomatic answer that didn't really answer the question. Jake was about to press the issue when his enhanced hearing picked up the sound of heavy footsteps approaching down the corridor. Multiple sets of them, moving with military precision. The Chancellor noticed his alert posture and raised an eyebrow. "You can hear them coming?" 6 guards, moving fast, Jake said automatically. "They're agitated about something." The door burst open without any request for entry, which Jake had already learned was a serious breach of protocol in the Imperial Palace. 6 guards in different armor than the ones he'd seen before rushed into the room, their weapons drawn. Behind them came a figure that made Jake's newly acquired political knowledge immediately identify him as trouble. Admiral Korath was the Empire's military commander, a massive alien from the warrior species known as the Varknith. He stood over 2.5 meters tall, with muscled gray skin covered in ritual scars and 4 arms that ended in clawed hands. His face was dominated by a prominent bony ridge above his eyes, and his expression was one of barely controlled rage. "You," The admiral pointed one of his claws at Jake. You dare to claim the right to rule over warriors who have bled for this empire? Chancellor Vextar stepped between Jake and the admiral, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. Admiral Korath, you forget yourself. This is the Imperial Palace, and this being is the Empress's chosen. Chosen? Admiral Korath let out a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so threatening. This soft human has never seen battle. He has never led troops into combat or made the hard decisions that war requires. Yet because he ate some mystical food, we are supposed to accept him as our future emperor? Jake felt the symbiotic organism stir within his mind, providing him with information about Varknith culture and military customs. He understood now that this wasn't just political opposition, it was a formal challenge. Among the Varknith, leadership had to be earned through strength and proven in combat. Admiral, Jake said, stepping around the Chancellor, I understand your concerns. If I were in your position, I'd probably feel the same way. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. Do not condescend to me, human. I'm not condescending, Jake replied calmly. I'm agreeing with you. You're right, I haven't proven myself as a warrior or a leader. The bond has given me knowledge, but knowledge isn't the same as experience. The tension in the room seemed to ease slightly. The Admiral's claws retracted a few centimeters and his guards lowered their weapons fractionally. However, Jake continued, I think you're wrong about one thing. This isn't about whether I'm worthy of commanding your respect. It's about whether you're willing to give the Empress's decision the respect it deserves. The Admiral's eyes flashed dangerously. You question my loyalty to the Empress? Jake shook his head. I'm questioning your understanding of what loyalty means. The Empress chose to follow the ancient laws because she believes in the traditions that built this empire. If you can't respect that choice, then maybe you're not as loyal as you think you are. The silence that followed was so tense that Jake could practically feel the anger radiating from the Admiral. For a moment, he thought he might have pushed too hard and was about to find out what Varknith claws could do to human flesh. Then Admiral Korath threw back his head and let out a booming laugh. You have spine, human. I will give you that. He studied Jake with new interest. Very well. I will not oppose this union ... yet, but know this. The first time you show weakness, the first time your inexperience puts Imperial lives at risk, I will be there to remove you from power. The ancient laws may have chosen you, but they do not protect you from the consequences of failure. Jake nodded seriously. I wouldn't expect them to. The Admiral gestured to his guards and they filed out of the room as quickly as they had entered. Before leaving, Admiral Korath turned back to Jake one more time. The Empress believes you will grow into your role. For her sake, I hope she is right. He paused at the door. But I will be watching, human. And if you disappoint her, he didn't need to finish the threat. Jake understood perfectly. After the Admiral left, Chancellor Vextar turned to Jake with an expression of grudging admiration. That was well handled, Your Highness. You managed to avoid a direct confrontation while not appearing weak. Very diplomatic. Jake sank into a nearby chair, suddenly exhausted. Great, so I've got the military commander planning to assassinate me if I screw up. I'm supposed to marry someone I met yesterday, and I still don't know the first thing about actually running an empire. This is going well. The Chancellor allowed himself a small smile. Welcome to galactic politics, Your Highness. It only gets more complicated from here. As if to prove his point, Jake's communication device chimed with an urgent message. The display showed a priority alert from the Imperial Intelligence Service. Separatist movements in 3 systems have declared independence. They refuse to recognize the authority of an alien upstart as future emperor. Rebellion appears imminent. Jake stared at the message and realized that his problems were just beginning. The Imperial War Room was a study in controlled chaos. Holographic displays showed the positions of rebel fleets across 3 star systems, while officers from dozens of different species worked at stations monitoring communications, troop movements, and supply lines. The air hummed with tension and the constant chatter of military communications. Jake stood next to Empress Zarathil at the central command table, trying to process the flood of information being presented by the senior staff. The symbiotic organism in his mind was working overtime, translating alien languages and providing context for military terms he'd never heard before. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose while solving complex puzzles. The Centauri Federation has declared complete independence, reported Intelligence Director Scylla, a spider-like alien with 8 delicate arms that moved constantly as she spoke. They've seized 3 Imperial shipyards and are holding approximately 50,000 Imperial citizens as protective custody. The Vegan Collective and the Outer Rim Coalition have made similar declarations. Admiral Korath stepped forward. His 4 arms crossed in a gesture that Jake now recognized as extreme displeasure. The rebels chose their moment well. They waited until news of the engagement spread throughout the Empire. They see this as a sign of weakness. Jake felt the eyes of every person in the room turn toward him. Some looks were curious, others skeptical, and a few openly hostile. He was the problem they were all thinking about, but too polite to mention directly. What are their specific demands? The Empress asked, her voice calm despite the crisis unfolding around them. Director Scylla consulted her display. They want the betrothal cancelled, a new succession established according to traditional bloodlines, and increased autonomy for Outer Rim systems. They're threatening to execute Imperial citizens if their demands aren't met within 72 hours. The Empress turned to Jake, and he could see the weight of decision in her star-filled eyes. What do you think we should do? The question hit Jake like a physical blow. She was actually asking for his opinion on a matter of galactic war and peace. Every person in the room was waiting to hear what the alien upstart had to say about Imperial military policy. Jake's mind raced through the information the symbiotic organism had provided. He understood the political implications, the military capabilities of the rebel systems, and the historical precedents for this type of crisis. But understanding facts and making life-or-death decisions were very different things. I think, Jake said slowly, that we need to understand what this is really about. They're not just rebelling against the marriage, they're rebelling against change. The question is whether we try to crush that rebellion or find a way to address their underlying concerns. Admiral Korath made a sound of disgust. The only thing rebels understand is force. We should send the fleet to each system and remind them what happens to those who defy the Empire. And kill 50,000 innocent civilians in the process? Jake asked. That doesn't sound like something an empire should do to its own people. The Admiral's eyes flashed dangerously. Sometimes sacrifice is necessary to maintain order. This is precisely the kind of soft thinking that will destroy the Empire. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but the symbiotic organism seemed to dampen the emotion, helping him think more clearly. Admiral, with respect, I don't think this is about being soft or hard. It's about being smart. He turned to address the room. These 3 systems didn't rebel in isolation. They coordinated their actions, which means they've been planning this for a while. They were looking for an excuse, and our engagement gave them one. But the real problem is that they don't feel like they have a voice in the Empire. Director Scylla's multiple eyes focused on Jake with new interest. What are you suggesting? Jake took a deep breath, hoping he wasn't about to make a terrible mistake. I'm suggesting that I go to the Centauri Federation and negotiate with them directly. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the hum of the ship's life support systems. Then everyone started talking at once. Absolutely not. Admiral Korath roared. You cannot put the future Emperor at risk. The security implications are impossible to manage, Director Scylla added. It would be seen as a sign of weakness, Chancellor Vextar protested. Only the Empress remained silent, studying Jake's face with an unreadable expression. Listen, Jake said, raising his voice to cut through the protests. Right now, I'm part of the problem. They see me as some outsider who's trying to take over their empire. But what if I show up and prove that I'm not interested in ruling over them? I'm interested in serving with them. The rebels have already demonstrated their hostility, the Admiral pointed out. They would likely kill you on sight. Jake nodded. That's possible. But if they do, then you'll have all the justification you need to use military force. And if they don't, If they're willing to talk, then maybe we can solve this without a war. The Empress finally spoke. The ancient laws speak of leadership through wisdom as well as strength. But the risks are mine to take, Jake finished. Look, I know I'm new to all this. I know I haven't proven myself yet. But someone has to take the first step toward ending this crisis, and maybe it should be the person they're rebelling against. Admiral Korith stepped closer to Jake, looming over him with all four arms spread wide. You would stake the stability of the Empire on your untested diplomatic skills? Jake met the Admiral's gaze steadily. I would stake it on the belief that most people want peace more than they want war. Even rebels. The Admiral studied him for a long moment, then turned to the Empress. Your Majesty, I cannot recommend this course of action from a security standpoint, however... He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internally. There is wisdom in facing one's enemies directly. It is the Varkneth way. The Empress looked around the room, reading the faces of her advisors. What about the other rebel systems? If this works with Centauri, will they follow? Director Selah manipulated her displays, bringing up intelligence reports. Centauri is the largest and most influential of the three. If they return to Imperial allegiance, the others would likely follow. But if negotiations fail, then we'll be exactly where we are now, Jake said. Except we'll know we tried diplomacy first. The Empress was quiet for several minutes, the weight of command visible in her posture. Finally, she nodded. Very well. We will attempt negotiation, but not alone. She turned to the Admiral. You will escort him with a small fleet. Large enough to ensure his safety, small enough to avoid appearing threatening. Admiral Korith's expression suggested he thought this was the worst idea in galactic history. But he bowed his head in acceptance. As you command, Your Majesty. Jake felt a mixture of relief and terror. He just volunteered to fly into hostile territory and convince an armed rebellion to stand down. The symbiotic organism was providing him with information about negotiation tactics and diplomatic protocols. But none of that changed the fact that he was about to risk not just his own life, but the stability of an entire galactic empire. There's one more thing, the Empress said quietly. If you do this, if you succeed, it will prove to the entire galaxy that you truly are worthy to rule beside me. Jake looked into her star-filled eyes and realized that this wasn't just about ending a rebellion. This was his chance to prove that a broke cargo hauler from Earth could actually become someone worthy of standing next to the most powerful woman in the galaxy. When do we leave? He asked. Admiral Korith showed his teeth in what might have been a smile. Immediately, human. And may whatever gods you worship be watching over us all. The journey to the Centauri Federation took 18 hours through hyperspace, giving Jake plenty of time to second-guess his decision. He spent most of the trip in his quarters aboard the Imperial battleship Righteous Fury, studying everything. The symbiotic organism could tell him about Centauri culture and politics. The Centaurians were a proud species with a long tradition of independence. They had joined the Empire voluntarily over 2 centuries ago, but only after negotiating extensive autonomy rights. Their leader, Chancellor Kethver, was known for his intelligence and his fierce loyalty to his people. He was also known for his deep distrust of outsiders and his belief that the Empire had become too centralized over the years. Admiral Korith had insisted on bringing a full escort fleet, 12 battleships, 30 frigates, and enough firepower to level a small moon. Jake had argued for a smaller force, but the Admiral had been immovable on the subject of security. Now, as they dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Centauri system, Jake wondered if they looked more like negotiators or invaders. Incoming. Transmission from Centauri Control, reported the communications officer, a nervous-looking Terran who kept glancing at Jake as if he couldn't believe a fellow human was about to become emperor. Put it through, Admiral Korith commanded. The main screen flickered to life, showing the stern face of a Centaurian military commander. Centaurians look somewhat like tall, elegant cats with golden fur and large eyes that seem to see everything. This particular Centaurian was wearing the insignia of a fleet admiral and did not look happy. Imperial fleet, you are in violation of Centaurian sovereign space? Withdraw immediately, or we will be forced to defend ourselves. Admiral Korath stepped forward. This is Admiral Korath of the Imperial Navy. We carry diplomatic envoys under flag of truce. We request safe passage to the capital. The Centaurian admiral's ears flattened against his head. We do not recognize Imperial diplomatic immunity at this time. State your business or depart. Jake took a deep breath and moved to where the Centaurian could see him clearly. My name is Jake Martinez. I believe Chancellor Kethver wants to meet with me. The Centaurian's eyes widened slightly. The pretender to the throne. The man who ate a sandwich and accidentally got engaged, Jake corrected with a slight smile. I'd like to talk to your Chancellor about how we can resolve this situation without anyone getting hurt. There was a long pause while the Centaurian consulted with someone off-screen. Finally, he turned back to face them. You will be granted safe passage to Centauri Prime. Your escort fleet will remain at the system's edge. You may bring one ship and minimal security. Admiral Korath's 4 hands clenched into fists. Absolutely unacceptable. The future Emperor requires proper protection. Jake put a hand on the Admiral's arm. It's okay. I'll take a shuttle and a small security team. You keep the fleet ready in case things go wrong. The Admiral turned to stare at him. You would trust your life to rebels who have already threatened to execute Imperial citizens? I would trust that they're smart enough not to start a galactic war by killing me, Jake replied. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Several people in the bridge crew winced at the question. Apparently asking, what's the worst that could happen, was considered bad luck in most galactic cultures. 2 hours later, Jake found himself aboard a diplomatic shuttle approaching Centauri Prime. The planet was beautiful, a world of golden continents and silver oceans, with 3 small moons that cast complex patterns of light and shadow across the surface. The planetary capital was built into the side of a massive mountain range, its spires reaching toward the sky like the claws of some enormous crystal creature. His security detail consisted of 6 Imperial guards and Lieutenant Yurix, a young Centaurian officer who served in the Imperial Navy and had volunteered to act as cultural liaison. Jake was grateful for her presence. Having a Centaurian with him might help prove that the Empire wasn't entirely made up of outsiders trying to control their lives. The shuttle was directed to a landing pad high in the mountains, surrounded by impressive defensive installations. As they disembarked, Jake was struck by the thin air and the magnificent view of the valley below. Centauri Prime's gravity was slightly lighter than Earth standard, making each step feel strangely bouncy. Chancellor Kethver was waiting for them at the entrance to the mountain palace. He was tall even for a Centaurian, with silver fur that marked him as elderly and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Jake's appearance in a single glance. He wore traditional Centaurian robes that flowed around him like liquid gold, and his bearing radiated the confidence of someone who had spent decades in positions of power. So, the Chancellor said in accented Standard Galactic, you are the human who would be Emperor. Jake inclined his head respectfully. I'm the human who ate something he probably shouldn't have and is trying to figure out what to do about it. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Chancellor. The Chancellor's ears twitched. Jake's enhanced understanding told him this was a sign of amusement. Your reputation for unusual honesty appears to be accurate. Come, we have much to discuss. The Chancellor led them through corridors carved directly from the living rock of the mountain. The walls were covered in intricate patterns that seemed to tell the story of Centaurian civilization, from their early tribal days through their expansion to the stars and eventual alliance with the Empire. Jake found himself genuinely fascinated by the artwork, and the Chancellor noticed his interest. You appreciate our history, the Chancellor observed. I'm learning that every species has their own story about how they came to be part of the Empire, Jake replied. I'm starting to understand that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to governing different worlds. The Chancellor stopped walking and turned to study Jake more carefully. An interesting perspective. Most Imperial officials assume that efficiency requires uniformity. Maybe that's part of the problem. Jake said they continued through the palace until they reached a circular chamber with a domed ceiling that showed a real-time view of the stars above. The Chancellor gestured for Jake to sit in one of two chairs positioned in the center of the room, while his security detail remained near the entrance. "Let us speak plainly," the Chancellor said once they were seated. "My people rebelled not because of you specifically, but because of what you represent, the continuing centralization of imperial power, and the dismissal of our traditional autonomy." Jake nodded. "I understand that. And I want you to know that I have no interest in taking away your autonomy. Actually, I think the Empire could learn a lot from how Centauri governs itself." The Chancellor's eyes narrowed. Pretty words. "But what happens when the imperial bureaucracy demands compliance with regulations that conflict with our cultural values? What happens when economic policies benefit the core worlds at the expense of the rim territories?" Jake leaned forward. "What if those policies could be changed? What if the Empire became more flexible, more willing to adapt to local needs instead of forcing everyone into the same mold? The Empress would never agree to such decentralization." "You might be surprised," Jake said. "She's smarter than anyone gives her credit for, and she cares more about the welfare of her people than about maintaining power for its own sake." The Chancellor was quiet for several minutes, thinking. Finally, he spoke again. "There is something you should know about the timing of our rebellion." Jake waited. "We have been monitoring Imperial communications. There are forces within the Empire who want you eliminated. They see you as a threat to the established order, and they have been encouraging separatist movements throughout the Rim territories. Our rebellion was accelerated by promises of support from these factions." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying there's a conspiracy against me within the Imperial government?" "I'm saying that your engagement to the Empress has upset more than just Outer Rim separatists. There are those in the core worlds who would prefer to see you dead rather than crowned." The Chancellor stood and walked to a wall display, bringing up a star map that showed the locations of various fleet movements. "The forces that promised to support our rebellion have not materialized. We believe they never intended to help us. They wanted us to eliminate you for them, or at least weaken you enough that their own forces could finish the job." Jake studied the display, his enhanced mind processing the implications. Someone had manipulated the Centaurians into rebelling, hoping either that they would kill him or that the crisis would destroy his credibility with the Empress. "So what do we do now?" Jake asked. The Chancellor turned back to him with something that might have been respect in his eyes. "Now, human, we discuss what real autonomy might look like under a more flexible empire. And then we prepare to face whoever has been playing games with both of our peoples." Jake smiled grimly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Outside the mountain palace, hidden sensors detected the approach of ships that weren't part of Admiral Korath's fleet. Ships that broadcast no identification codes and showed no imperial markings. The real test was about to begin. The attack came without warning. Jake was in the middle of negotiating a new autonomy agreement with Chancellor Kethver when the mountain palace shook from the impact of orbital bombardment. Emergency lights flickered on as dust rained from the carved ceiling, and somewhere in the distance, alarms began wailing. Lieutenant Yerrix rushed into the chamber, her feline features twisted with concern. "Chancellor, we're detecting unknown ships in high orbit. They're targeting the palace directly." Chancellor Kethver's ears flattened against his head as he activated a holographic display. The image showed at least 20 warships in attack formation above the planet, their weapons charging for another bombardment. Jake didn't recognize the ship designs, but his enhanced knowledge identified them as belonging to the hegemony, a collection of wealthy core worlds that had always opposed what they saw as excessive imperial expansion. "The hegemony?" Jake said grimly. "They're making their move." The Chancellor nodded, his golden eyes flashing with anger. "It appears we have both been manipulated. They wanted me to rebel against the Empire, and when that failed to remove you, they decided to take more direct action." Another series of impacts shook the palace, and Jake could hear the sound of stone cracking somewhere above them. The hegemony ships were trying to bring the entire mountain down on top of them. Jake's wrist communicator crackled to life with Admiral Korath's voice. "Martinez, the fleet is under attack by hegemony forces. They had ships hidden in the asteroid belt. This was planned well in advance. Are you secure? Define secure, Jake replied as another bombardment made the chamber lights flicker. We're trapped in a mountain that someone is trying to demolish. The shuttle bay has been destroyed, Lieutenant Yarrick reported. We have no way off the planet, and our orbital defenses are overwhelmed. Jake felt the symbiotic organism in his mind working frantically, processing tactical information and strategic options. The situation was bad. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped on a planet under bombardment. But there might be a way out. Chancellor, Jake said, do you still have communication with your fleet commanders? Yes, though our ships are heavily outnumbered. What if they weren't? Jake asked. What if they had help from Imperial forces? The Chancellor's ears perked up. You're suggesting an alliance? I'm suggesting that we were both played by the same enemy. Maybe it's time to stop fighting each other and start fighting the people who actually want to destroy us. Jake activated his communicator again. Admiral Korath, I need you to relay a message to the Empress. Tell her that Jake Martinez formally requests alliance with the Centauri Federation under emergency conditions. Authorization code? He paused, the symbiotic organism providing him with the necessary Imperial protocols. Authorization code Omega 77. There was a pause before the Admiral's voice came back, sounding shocked. Martinez, that's a wartime alliance code. You're asking for immediate incorporation of Centaurian forces into the Imperial battle group. That's exactly what I'm asking for. Chancellor Kethver looked at Jake with new respect. You would trust our ships to fight alongside yours? After we rebelled against your empire? You rebelled because you thought we were the enemy, Jake said. Now we know who the real enemy is. The Chancellor considered this for a moment, then activated his own communication system. Fleet Command, this is Chancellor Kethver. All Centaurian vessels are hereby ordered to coordinate with Imperial forces against hegemony attackers. Authorization Bloodstar 9. The change in the battle was immediate and dramatic. Jake could hear it through the palace's communication systems. Centaurian ships that had been fighting defensively suddenly began coordinated attacks alongside Admiral Korath's fleet. The hegemony forces, expecting to face divided enemies, found themselves overwhelmed by a combined force that knew how to work together. Hegemony flagship is retreating, Lieutenant Yarrick reported, monitoring the tactical display. They're pulling back to the edge of the system. But Jake noticed something troubling in the communication patterns. Wait, check the ship registrations on those hegemony vessels. The Chancellor brought up detailed sensor readings, and Jake's enhanced mind immediately spotted the problem. Those aren't all hegemony ships. Look at the engine configurations. At least 6 of those vessels are Imperial Navy designs. Lieutenant Yarrick's eyes widened. Someone in the Imperial fleet is working with the hegemony? Jake's communicator crackled again, but this time it wasn't Admiral Korath's voice. Instead, a cultured accent that Jake recognized from his briefings filled the chamber. Greetings, Pretender, said Chancellor Vextar. I do hope you're enjoying your final moments. The betrayal hit Jake like a physical blow. Chancellor Vextar, the Empire's chief advisor, the person who had been helping him learn Imperial politics and protocol, the person who had access to Imperial fleet movements and strategic planning. Vextar, Jake said, his voice cold. I should have known. You should have known many things, the Chancellor's voice replied smoothly. You should have known that a cargo hauler from a backwater world could never be fit to rule a galactic empire. You should have known that there are those of us who have served the empire for centuries and will not see it fall into the hands of an unworthy alien. The ancient laws chose him, Chancellor Kethver interjected. The Kethmoran bond cannot be faked or forced. Ancient superstitions, Vextar replied dismissively. The Empire needs leaders who understand political reality, not mystical nonsense about symbiotic organisms. Jake felt anger building in his chest, but the symbiotic organism helped him channel it into clarity rather than rage. So you manipulated the Rim territories into rebelling, hoping they'd kill me. When that didn't work, you brought in hegemony forces to finish the job. A crude summary, but essentially accurate. The hegemony has promised significant autonomy to core worlds that support them. and certain Imperial officials have found their offer attractive. Another bombardment shook the palace, but this time the impacts were lighter. The combined Imperial Centaurian fleet was clearly gaining the upper hand. "There's just one problem with your plan, Vextar," Jake said. "You underestimated what happens when you unite your enemies against a common threat." "The battle above is irrelevant," Vextar replied. "The mountain palace will fall, and you with it. The Empress will have no choice but to accept a new succession arrangement." Jake looked at Chancellor Kethver and Lieutenant Yorick's, seeing determination in their faces despite the desperate situation. "Maybe, but if we don't make it out of here, we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who was responsible." Jake activated his communicator's emergency broadcast mode, sending his message on every available frequency. "This is Jake Martinez speaking to all Imperial and Allied forces. Chancellor Vextar has betrayed the Empire and is working with hegemony forces to overthrow the rightful government. He orchestrated the Rim rebellions and is currently coordinating the attack on Centauri. Prime, all loyal Imperial citizens should consider him a traitor to the crown." The silence that followed was broken by Admiral Korath's voice, and Jake had never heard the Varknith warrior sound so angry. "Chancellor Vextar, by the authority invested in me by the Empress, you are under arrest for treason, sedition, and violation of your oath of service. Surrender immediately." Vextar's reply was cold and confident. "I think not, Admiral. You see, I'm no longer operating under Imperial authority. The Hegemony Council has offered me a position as Supreme Governor of the New Order. I suggest you surrender before—" His words were cut off abruptly as another voice filled the communication channel. A voice that made Jake's heart skip a beat. "This is Empress Zarathil speaking to all forces in the Centauri system," the Empress said, her musical voice carrying absolute authority. "Chancellor Vextar is hereby stripped of all titles and marked as an enemy of the state. Admiral Korath, you are authorized to use any means necessary to end this rebellion." Jake felt hope surge through him. The Empress was alive, and she was coming to help. "Jake," her voice continued, speaking directly to him now, "hold your position. We're almost there." Through the carved windows of the mountain palace, Jake could see new lights appearing in the sky. Not the harsh glare of weapons fire, but the steady glow of ships dropping out of hyperspace. A lot of ships. The real Imperial fleet had arrived, and Jake had the feeling that Chancellor Vextar was about to discover what happened to those who threatened the Empress's chosen mate. 3 months after the Battle of Centauri Prime, as historians were already calling it, Jake stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace watching the sunset paint the capital city in shades of gold and purple. The view was spectacular, but his mind was focused on the datapad in his hands containing the final reports from the conspiracy. Trials. Chancellor Vextar had been found guilty of treason and sentenced to life. Imprisonment on a penal colony in the Outer Rim. 7 other high-ranking Imperial officials had been implicated in the plot and faced similar fates. The Hegemony Council had been dissolved, and its member worlds were in the process of negotiating new relationships with the Empire. It had been a complete victory, but Jake couldn't help thinking about the cost. Over 2,000 Imperial citizens had died in the fighting, along with hundreds of Centaurians and Hegemony forces. Entire families torn apart because a group of power-hungry officials couldn't accept change. The symbiotic organism in his mind processed the emotions Jake felt about the losses, helping him understand them without being overwhelmed by grief. "You're thinking about the casualties again," Empress Zarathil said softly as she joined him on the observation deck. Even after 3 months of being engaged to her, Jake still felt his breath catch when she entered a room. She seemed to glow with an inner light that made the sunset pale by comparison. "Among other things," Jake admitted, "I keep wondering if there was a way to prevent all this. If I'd been smarter about Vextar's betrayal, if I'd understood the political situation better." The Empress moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the starlight and winter air scent that seemed to follow her everywhere. "You cannot blame yourself for the actions of others," Vextar made his choices, and they were driven by fear and prejudice. Not by anything you did or didn't do. Jake nodded, intellectually understanding her point but still struggling with the emotional weight of command. The symbiotic organism helps me process information, but it doesn't make the hard decisions easier. That's because wisdom isn't about having all the answers, the Empress said. It's about asking the right questions and being willing to live with the consequences of your choices. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as darkness fell. Finally, the Empress spoke again. The Centauran Autonomy Agreement has been ratified by the Imperial Council. Chancellor Kethver sends his regards and an invitation to visit Centauri Prime for their Harvest Festival next month. Jake smiled. I'd like that. I want to see how their new self-governance structures are working out. The Autonomy Agreement had been Jake's first major policy initiative as the future Emperor. Instead of the traditional imperial approach of centralized control, they had created a framework that allowed member worlds to maintain their own cultural and governmental systems, while still being part of the larger empire. It was a radical departure from centuries of imperial tradition, but early results suggested it was working. Admiral Korath has submitted his final report on the military integration protocols, the Empress continued. The joint training exercises between Imperial and former rebel forces have exceeded all expectations. He says that diversity of tactical approaches has actually strengthened our overall military effectiveness. Geek chuckled. I never thought I'd see the day when Admiral Korath would admit that change could be good for the military. He's also recommended you for the Order of Imperial Valor for your actions at Centauri Prime. Jake turned to look at her in surprise. For getting trapped in a mountain and talking to rebels? The Empress smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. For proving that sometimes the best way to end a war is to refuse to fight one. For showing that strength doesn't always mean using the biggest weapons. For demonstrating that a true leader serves their people, not the other way around. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. I was terrified the entire time. I had no idea what I was doing. Fear is not the opposite of courage, the Empress said gently. Fear is the price courage demands. And as for not knowing what you were doing, she gestured toward the datapad he was holding. The Social Stability Index has improved in every system that has adopted the new autonomy protocols. Economic productivity is up 17% across the empire. And for the first time in over a century, we have no active rebellions in any imperial territory. Jake looked down at the numbers again, hardly believing them himself. Sometimes, I still can't believe this all started because I was hungry and found a weird sandwich in a vending machine. The Empress laughed, a sound like silver bells in the wind. The ancient texts speak of destiny working in mysterious ways. Perhaps the universe has a sense of humor. Jake's wrist communicator chimed softly with an incoming message. He glanced at it and grinned. It's from my old friend Marcus. Back on Earth, he says he saw the news feeds about the human emperor and wants to know if it's really me. He also wants to know if being married to the most powerful woman in the galaxy means I can finally afford to buy him that beer I owe him. Can you? The Empress asked with mock seriousness. Jake pretended to consider the question carefully. Well, I suppose I could spare a few credits from the Imperial Treasury for such an important diplomatic mission. They laughed together and Jake marveled at how natural it felt. 3 months ago, the idea of joking with the ruler of a galactic empire would have been unthinkable. Now, it was just part of his daily routine. Speaking of Earth, the Empress said, I've been thinking about your suggestion regarding membership in the Empire. Jake had proposed that Earth be offered full membership rather than its current status as a protected territory. It was a controversial idea, since Earth was still considered a relatively primitive world by galactic standards. But Jake believed his homeworld had unique perspectives that could benefit the Empire. The Council voted to approve the proposal, the Empress continued. Earth will be invited to send representatives to the Imperial Senate, and they'll have the same autonomy rights as any other member world. Jake felt a surge of pride and gratitude. Thank you. That means more than you know. It means that my future husband's homeworld will have a voice in the empire he helps to rule. That seems only appropriate. Jake looked out at the city again, thinking about all the changes that had happened in such a short time. Do you think it will work? This new approach to governing the empire? The Empress was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I think it will work because it acknowledges something that the old system never did, that the empire is strongest when its people choose to be part of it, rather than being forced into compliance. And if it doesn't work, then we'll try something else, she said simply. That's what leadership means, being willing to adapt, to learn, to change course when necessary. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility but also the confidence that came from knowing he wasn't facing it alone. The symbiotic organism had given him knowledge and enhanced abilities. But it was his relationships with people like the Empress, Admiral Koreth, and Chancellor Kethver that gave him the strength to actually lead. There's one more thing, the Empress said, reaching into her robes and pulling out a small, ornate box. I have something for you. Jake opened the box to find a ring unlike anything he'd ever seen. It seemed to be carved from a piece of crystallized space, dark blue with points of light that moved like living stars. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and Jake could feel power humming within the crystal. It's made from the same material as the Imperial throne, the Empress explained. A substance that exists only in the hearts of certain neutron stars. It will help you channel the full potential of the symbiotic organism. Jake slipped the ring onto his finger and immediately felt the change. The constant background hum of information from the organism became clearer and more focused. His awareness expanded, allowing him to sense the emotional states of people throughout the palace, to understand the complex interplay of political forces across the empire, to feel the pulse of a civilization that spanned thousands of worlds. Wow, he said softly. The Empress smiled. Welcome to your full inheritance, Jake Martinez. Emperor of the Galactic Federation, protector of the Rimworlds, and the man who proved that sometimes the most unlikely people make the best leaders. As Jake looked out at the lights of the capital city, each one representing millions of beings who were now his responsibility, he thought about the vending machine on Nexus Station. Somewhere out there, other people were probably making simple decisions that would change their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. He hoped they would be as lucky as he had been, ready to change the galaxy. The Empress asked, taking his hand. Jake squeezed her fingers gently and smiled. I thought we already did. That was just the beginning, she said. The real adventure starts tomorrow. Jake looked at the woman who would soon be his wife, felt the power of his new ring, and thought about all the worlds and people depending on them to build something better than what had come before. Bring it on, he said. In the distance, ships were departing for the far corners of the empire, carrying news of the reforms and the promise of a future where diversity was strength rather than division.